ماشي. انا هحاول يعني I will try to be as fast as possible، بس لو في حاجه مش فاهمينها just stop me and tell me. تمام. Before we get started, I just want to declare or announce something regarding the project that I think I did this in the software design lab. By the end of sprint 3, which is basically this week, right, we are expecting to see a class diagram, and this is mandatory by every group. Every group needs to create a class diagram. تمام. If you don't know how to create a class diagram in lab 8 or lab 9 this week's, تمام, what we did in the morning and what we will do at the afternoon, تمام, we will create class diagram together. تمام. So the point is, why do you need to have them ready by sprint 3? Is because I want to see any class, any initial class diagram created, so that I can give you feedback and we can like manipulate and make things right if there's anything wrong. Okay, so this is mandatory by the final submission. Okay, what is not really mandatory is that after you create the class diagram is to refactor that class diagram into OOP, right, to implement the chatbot into OOP following that class diagram, right? Which one? Use case diagram? No, we don't need it. No, we need a class diagram. That's mandatory. The implementation of this class diagram, this is optional, but whoever is going to do it, of course, is going to have a higher grade. تمام. طيب, in order to do a class diagram, you need 3 things. First of all, before you do a class diagram, right, make sure that your code is modular, is fully modularized, meaning that your code is inside functions. There is no logic that is like scattered around the main loop or the while loop. Every logic is encapsulated with a function. Now check the lab 9 that we will give you today, inshallah, and you will be able to create a class diagram on Visual Paradigm. Once you finish this is the optional part. You can check the videos that I'm going to upload by the end of this week for a case study regarding object-oriented. Okay, and once you see these videos, you can implement the class diagram. You can literally follow the steps that I do. تمام. طيب, so it's optional to refactor the code into object-oriented based on the class diagram that you created, but it's going to guarantee you a higher mark. And it is optional also to have a graphical user interface, so you can submit your terminal-based application, but having a graphical user interface will make sure that you are in the A area, above 70. Okay? هتضمن ان انت جايب A في البروجكت once ان انت عامل الحاجات الاوبشنال اللي هي الايه الاوبشنال ان انت you refactor the code into object oriented. ده واحد. و you have a graphical user interface for the chatbot. تمام؟ مش كل حاجه شغاله terminal بس. تمام؟ طيب, just a sneak peek on what we are going to build. So I'm going to build this simple application here in 2 ways, right? This interface, it has a button, and whenever you write anything, you click on greet me, you see that this is printed. تمام. By the end of the next session, we're going to have something more advanced. تمام. I'm not sure that I'm going to finish this with this hour, but let's see. So let's get started. First of all, you are going to need a library. This is the GUI library. This is what builds the entire widgets or components. It's called tk-enter. So I'm going to say import الفونت باين. لا 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 لا, سوري. ايه, مش شغاله فيجوال ستوديو كود, ممكن يبقى شغاله على IDE تاني. Okay, طيب, from tk-enter, right, and this is by default, this is installed. You can find this whenever you install Python. You don't need to do any extra thing. I'm going to reference it as an alias to say this is going to be used as tk, right? So mainly for creating the bigger containers. In your code, of course, everyone is going to have his branch, تمام? But after you merge everything, right, most probably, maybe the branch is going to be deleted, but I told you how to keep the branches, to not delete the branch after the merge. But it's always good practice to have a comment like this, but not with a hash. يعني make a triple quotes, and before مثلا the lines of code that you implement, before the lines of code, maybe there is a function هنا مثلا somewhere underneath. So say that this is the author, انت مثلا مصطفى او اي حد, okay, and the date that you created this, تمام. Any couple of lines, any couple of functions, just make sure that this is written all over your code, حتى لو this is your own branch, even if this is your own branch. Okay, طيب I'm going to import this as TKA. The first class that I'm going to use is the TKA or the TK enter. Basically, this is used for bigger containers, and by bigger containers, we mean the root or the window itself or the application. Now, notice I'm going to run this application. I'm going to leave it running like this. Okay. Notice that this is called the window. The entire thing. This is called the window, right? So this is the biggest container you can get in TK enter, right? So for bigger containers or the top level containers as the window, you use this library. Now there is another version of the TK enter library that is called TTK. Now TTK is used for creating smaller widgets, right? We can actually say in the bigger containers, root, window, let's say window, and let's say frames for the time being. So window and frames. And we're going to understand what is frames in a second here. تمام? So for creating smaller widgets or components, by widgets we mean components يا جماعة, right? Which is basically labels, buttons, scroll bars, text areas, right? What else? All of these are components, okay? Input fields. These are called components or widgets. You are typically going to use TTK for it. تمام? So this is a label, right? This is a label. This is an input field. This is a button, and so on. تمام? Notice that these two elements, the input field and the label, is coupled in a section. There's some kind of a grid happening here, right? Can you notice this? There's some kind of a grid, meaning that this is, for example, this is the first section, and this is the second section that contains, for example, these two buttons, right? This kind of layout, we're going to see how to implement them, right? I'm just going to write a note here, because online you're going to see that most of people actually use TTK and TK interchangeably, right? So most of the time, for most widgets, TTK and TK can be used interchangeably. فاهمينها دي يا جماعة صح؟ يعني ممكن تستخدم دي أو تستخدم دي. They give you the same exact results. تمام؟ What we just said يا شباب اللي لسه داخلين إن إحنا عندنا TK enter دي اللايبرري اللي بتعمل لي ال GUI أو الجرافيكال يوزر انترفيس. تمام؟ فإحنا بنستخدم TK أو بنستخدم another sub version of this library is called TTK. تمام؟ طيب اللي احنا عايزين نوصل له هو الشكل ده. هنbuild something like this. You see this window? This is what we are going to build. تمام؟ طيب you can use this interchangeably, but there are differences, and please remind me to tell you what are the basic differences, right? So there are small or slight differences. Anyways, let's start with the initialization part. So let's say initialization. Okay. And let's say that I'm going to create from this class, I'm going to call, or from this script, I'm going to call the class TK, right? Notice that everything is literally objects here. That's why we needed to give you object-oriented to make sure to understand what's happening here, right? So this is not a function. This is a class called TK, right? So this is basically the firing of the application. This is what is going to return to you the app or the root or the window. Right, so I'm just going to save this in a variable, and I'm going to call it root. Some people call it online app or window or whatever, so I'm just going to call it root. Right, let's control save and run this. That's TK like this. It's the same exact meaning. Whatever this is going to return is going to return a window. Right, it's just going to return an empty window that doesn't contain anything. Okay. So if I run this, you should not see anything by the minute, but actually I forgot something. After the initialization, you need to follow up the initialization with firing the GUI loop, right? So firing the GUI loop is basically like this. Once we say that this is the object that is going to hold our menu, we need to make sure that this object is going to run. So I'm just going to say root and then main loop, right? Once you run this, you're going to see that you are given an empty window. This is the root here, right? Okay, this is the parent container, right? What I was saying to Muhammad or Magid is that make sure that all of your codes, the terminal-based version of your chatbot project, make sure that it is modularized. Make sure that everything is placed in functions. Why? Because the GUI itself is a main loop. right? This window, this is the main loop, and whenever you click on close, this main loop actually breaks and you break out of the loop, right? So whatever code, whatever functions that you are able to call inside the while loop inside the terminal, you should be able to call the same exact set of functions inside the GUI's loop. Okay, so the switch shouldn't be that major. تمام. طب anyways, let's start with giving this window a title. So I'm just going to say title, and I'm going to say something like symbol. Can someone close the AC please? معلش. جو ساعة جدا. تمام. So symbol app like this. تمام. Once you run, you can see that the title is actually written here. This is the title of the window. In main loop, this is the syntax of the GUI. In order to fire up and see the window that we have created and placed in this variable, right, we need to call the main loop. Main loop is the actual line that is going to be called by the end of the GUI script, right? So we are going to write whatever we are going to write here, but by the end, we need to call the main loop to keep the window running, up and running. Right? Once you close the window, the loop is broke. You broke out of the loop, right? The program has exit. Okay? لا كده تمام. معايا هنا؟ Okay. So I'm just going to set this here. Okay. Let's talk about resizability. Now, if we see the window one more time, you can see that it's resizable. Maybe this is something that you want, and maybe this is something that you do not want. لسه عامله دلوقتي. اللي عامل اللاين ده هي الحته دي بس. And I give it a title اللي هي symbol app اللي هي دي. That's it. تمام. So to make this unresizable, so we can call root.resizable, and we can say that this is going to be false and this is going to be false. It takes two parameters. Right? If I save and run this, you can see that there is no, you cannot stretch this anymore. Actually, there is no, the cursor doesn't change. تمام. طيب, what do we have else? You can actually set the basic or the default width and height, the space. Okay, so we can say that, let's say I want to have my, this is using the geometry, I want to have my window to be, for example, 600 pixels by 400 pixels, and this is the width, the 600 is the width, and this is the height. You can run this, and this is the result here. Okay, I don't care about this at the moment, but I just wanted to show it to you. Now there is something that I'm not going to do, and you need to search for it. Actually, it's called root.icon bitmap. An icon bitmap gives you the ability to, let me just run this. It gives you the ability to put an icon, related to your application here, right? So this is a good gesture. So search for how to use icon bitmap, right? It has some stuff in how to convert an image to a bitmap and so on. So I don't want to get into these details. I just want to give you the straight basics, right? So let's start with the actual the widgets inside the application. So this is the part where we call the widgets. Okay, I'm going to start with the default one. You can see here that this is the goal. This is what we want to build. I will start with the label. So I can call from TK. Notice that I told you that widgets is usually called from TTK, right? But it's interchangeable if you want to use TK or TTK with slight differences that I am going to show you, right? So let's say that I'm going to use TK for this, and I'm going to create a label, right? The first thing that you do once you create a widget is that, first of all, the first argument is that you need to associate it with the root. Right, so you need to say that this label object, خلي بالك, this is a class, huh? This is a class, so this is going to return a label object, right? So I'm just going to store this in a variable, and I'm going to say, for example, here this is a name. Enter your name, so I'm just going to call it what? Name label. Right? The first thing that you do whenever you create an object of the label is that you need to associate it with the super container, which is in this case is called a root. تمام. So we are going to pass the root as this is the parent container, and then I can write some text. Let's say that the text I want to see, that's the actual value here. Enter your name. Right? All right. So this is the first part. So you always create the object, right? And then you pack it into the window. and I will show you what does backing mean, right? So I just created the label, right? And I associate it with the root. Let's run this. If you run this, you will see that there is no label. There is no enter your name anywhere in the GUI, right? Because there is a step missing. I told you, you always create the object, whatever widget that you want to create, just create it and store it in a variable, and then make sure to do the following. Make sure to say that name label is going to be packed into the window. It's as if you're aligning or inserting it to the window, right? So once you do this, you will see that the window, the entire window is actually having only the label enter your name. بس هنعدل دي. تمام؟ طيب. Okay. So let's do the following. I'm just going to give it a fixed width and height so that we get to see what we are working on. تمام. Notice that what I've talked about is packing or inserting elements to window. Right? And this is done via 3 techniques. The first one and the easiest one, right, is backing. It's really annoying. So there is a different method. It's called grid, a grid system. I'm going to show you the grid in just a minute. Guys, I want you to keep up with me. If there is anything that you want to ask about it. Tamam? And the second method to align or insert elements to a window is place, right? And the third one is called, just as I've said, grid. We're going to see back and we're going to see grid. Right? Now, back actually takes a very interesting argument called side, right? And side actually means the orientation. Do you want to see, let me just have this running here. Do you want to see enter your name at the right, at the left, or at the right, or at the middle? Okay, so side is the argument that you can use for that. By default, if you did not pass any side variables or side values, this is understood to be of value of top. Okay? All right, so the default is top. There is a unique thing about the value top, which is basically, it means if the side is top, right, first of all, it's going to be positioned at the top. That's the meaning, that's the default meaning. And the second thing, that it will take the entire horizontal space, right? So it's going to take the entire width of the window. This is taking the entire width of the window since it has the side top. Okay? How can we tell? How can we tell that? Maybe if I give this a background color, maybe this would be actually representable, right? So to give a background color or a foreground, you can actually give this value from here. You can actually, if you click on comma, you can see the couple of stuff that you can give. You can give a color, a background color, a compound, a cursor, a border, and a border width. All of these attributes that you can give. Right? Check the documentation for these exactly, because I'm not going to go through all of them. But the background color, I can use the value of green, and I can run this. And you can see now that it is taking the exact size of the label, right? Now, how do we make it take the entire width of the screen? I just told you that if it's top, it is going to span the entire width of the screen, right? But actually, it needs an additional argument. It's called fill. Right? So if you give it fill by x, this means that fill the entire x-axis. All right? So if it is side of top and you give it the value of fill to be x-axis, it's going to span the entire horizontal space. So let us run this. Right? And you can see that it's spanning the entire horizontal space. Okay? Type. Let's add another one. Let's add a foreground. This is the color of the text itself, and I'm going to say this is white. Another thing that actually is going to be really useful to you, and instead of using these static values, is the following. We can actually search for colors in, actually I search for this in hexadecimal, right? Pick the first list or the first website, right? And choose any color from these and pick the hexadecimal value. Okay? I'm just going to take this value, and instead of green, I'm going to place it here. All right? So it's the same thing. Now, remember when I told you that there is a difference between TK and TTK? Actually, we can do the same exact thing. Let's say that this is name label 2. Enter, for example, I don't know, your last name. Right? And this is going to be called from TTK, but there is going to be an error. It's going to tell you unknown background property, right? So TTK is kind of, you can say that TTK is shortened functions, right? It's not that powerful, right? So if you give TTK a background and a foreground, it will tell you that I don't understand these, right? But TK, it handles it like a champ, right? You can pass to it a background, you can pass it a foreground, you can pass it the font. Everything is working in TK, right? But there are some widgets that are callable from TK and not callable from TTK, and vice versa. That's why you need to be aware. You need to search for this on the documentation. Okay, but I'm going to tell you what exactly you're going to need for your application. So I'm just going to remove this line. Actually, we can update the font as well. So I'm just going to say font, right? And for the font, there's a comma here. For the font, you need to pick a font that is inside or installed in your machine. You want to know the fonts in your machine, just easily go to your search bar and write font and pick the font settings, right? And you can search for any font here, right? There is a font that I personally like for web development. It's called Avenir Next LT Pro. You can download this. So I'm just going to use this. Right? And actually, you can have this as a table. So you're going to give the value of the font and the font size. Let's say the font size is going to be, this is going to be really ugly, right? It's going to be really big like this. So I'm just going to make it 11. Okay? All right. So this is the label. Now, let's see what else is in the list. Style the label. We did the styling, and then what do we have list? Adding a quit button. Okay, let's add a button. Let's add a different kind of widget. So I'm just going to delete all of these elements. Okay, and let's say that we are going to add a button. So let's say that I will use TK to create a button, just the same way I created this label, right? So create a button like this, right? Associated with the root, right? The same thing that we did here, okay? And give this button a text value. And let's say the text is going to be, I don't know, quit, for example, right? And let's place this in a variable and call it quit button, right? Okay, and now we want to do something after creating the button. What is left, Yagama? What should we do? Pack it, exactly. We need to pack it into the window. So I'm just going to say pack, and let us say that this is going to be lift, right? So the label is going to be lift and the button is going to be lift, right? Do you know what's going to happen? Can anyone guess what is the looks? هيبقى ايه؟ overwrite ازاي؟ يعني هيجوا تحت بعض ولا فوق بعض ولا فوق بعض؟ Okay. Let's run this. Actually, they're going to be placed right يعني next to each other. Okay? Because what's happening here is that name label, you gave the name label, maybe you said underneath of each other, yeah, Ali, because there is a fill of X. So you thought maybe it fills the entire width. So it takes the entire width, then beneath of it comes the button, right? But actually, if you changed the side to be left, not top, fill of X is not going to be enough to stretch the entire element across the width. You will need to add one more thing that is going to be called expand. I'm going to talk about expand in just a minute, right? But if you have the side to be top and fill of X, you have the entire width. Once you change the side to left or right, you do not have the entire width. You only have the width of the text of that element. Okay? معايا؟ طيب. So once these two are left, is going to be left-sided right next to each other, like this. تمام? One additional difference between TK and TTK, you see how this button is looking like حرفيا, it doesn't look good at all, right? And you see this goal that we want to get, this is the same button. I didn't actually do any styling, by the way, right? So this is one of the differences between TK and TTK, right? So if you made this to be TTK, you can see that the button here is going to be looking a little bit nicer, right? So it's going to be looking like this. So try to, switch between them, but whenever there's something related to styling, background, foreground, or fonts, whatever, use TK. Whatever you need to make the looks of a widget looking a little bit nicer, use TTK. Okay? اللي هو ايه؟ It doesn't do anything for the minute. It doesn't do anything. right? That's a good question. What is the functionality behind any button? Well, you add the functionality via another property called command. This is where we actually create a function and we pass it to command. But I'm not going to do any custom function. I'm not going to say, for example, define a function like this. I'm going to use a built-in function. The point of exit or quit is that you can exit the application, right? Right, to exit the application. So you can exit the application by saying, if I have the root, then I can actually destroy the root, right? This is the function. I'm passing the function body only, okay? So once you click on this quit, this command is going to be fired and you can exit out of the application, right? So if I run this and you click on quit, you can exit the application, okay? Now let us take another example on how can we place this, or how can we put an entry here or an input field, right? So let me just check the third one. Or before the button, we can talk a little bit about well, let's make a button to greet you. All right, let's make a button to greet you. All right, so I'm going to create another button. So I'm going to call this greet button, right? And the text is going to be greet me, right? And the function here is going to be a function that I will call, that I will create. So I'm just going to call this function greet, right? And notice you do not call the function. This is not a function call. You actually pass the function body, the function definition. You pass it and give it to this command property. Let's say that I'm going to define the function here, and all it does is that it say hello world. Okay, now let's pack this greet button into the application. Now the order here is actually depending on the sequence of the backing. So the first thing that you backed is the name label, and then we packed the quit, and then we backed the greet, and all of them are to the left, so they are going to be appearing on the same line. Okay, طيب. Let's say now that we want to place this underneath. Let's say we want to add an input field first, right? And then after we add an input field, I want to have the input field and enter your name at the top like this, right? And these two at the bottom, at the second or the lower section, right? Before we do that, I can actually show you some batting techniques. Notice that there is no space at all between this element and this element and this element and this element, right? This is where we can talk about batting a little bit, right? So let's talk about this in this name label. So we have two types of batting. The outer batting, I don't know why did they call it batting in Python, but actually in HTML and CSS, this is called margin, right? So the margin or the outer batting is the space between the element and the next element, whether it's right, left, top, or bottom. This is the outer batting, okay? And we have other type of batting, which is basically the other one, which is inner batting, right? And inner batting is basically related to the element itself, right? From this text from here, how much do you want to see red space or red background, right? Do you want to inner bat or add an inner batting to the top, to the bottom, to the right, to the left? معايا؟ طيب. So let's see how can we add this batting thing, all right? Actually, you can add the batting to the name label here, to the pack method, right? So I'm going to say maybe I want to see a bat from the right and left to be something like 10 pixels. All right. So this is the outer batting. The outer batting is done via pad X and pad Y, and the inner batting is done via iPad X and iPad Y. Okay, you can actually say this as well. You can say a tuple that, let's say from the left, I don't really want to have a space here. I want it to start from the start of the window. So the left is going to be 0, and I want to add 10 pixels to the right of my element. And this is the result. right? You can do inner padding, right, using iPad. So I'm just going to say that iPad is going to take a value of 4, for example. This is right and left, and iPad Y is going to do, this is top and bottom. This is going to be something like 4 as well, right? So this is the iPad, right? And this is what, this is the padding, the outer padding. Okay, مجمعين معايا يا جماعه؟ في حاجه صعبه في اللي بيتقال؟ طيب لحد دلوقتي لا تمام. We can do the same exact padding things to the button via the pack and to the greeting button via the pack as well, right? But I'm not going to do it. Just one is enough. Okay. Let's talk about the input fields or the greet button. We did the greet button, so let's have an input field, right? So after the name label, I'm going to add an input field. So this is going to be input field. Now we can say that this is going to be input, or let's say name input field. This is the variable, right? From TK, I'm going to call entry. Entry is the class that you use in order to create an input field like this. Okay, so entry, just like any other widget, it's going to take what? The root, the window that we have created. Okay, معايا علي انت هنا؟ طيب, so it takes the root, and maybe you want to have some text, but I'm not going to write any text inside of it, right? I will give it a width, let's say a width of 8, and basically this is the number of characters, the length of characters that this input field should take, right? Once we have the widget ready, we can pack it into our window. So I'm just going to say this is left, and let's run this, right? And you see that this is the input field. Okay, actually this is using TK. It doesn't look like this one, right? Exactly. So if we did TTK, you can see a difference. It's going to be looking a little bit nicer, and there's an outline and so on, right? And you can focus on it. Okay, we can actually increase the width. Let's say the width is going to be something like 20, and you can see that the input field is going to increase with you. Now all of this is good. Now this is the time where we create our layout. I want to have these two together at the top, and I want to have the buttons at the bottom. Okay, all right. Actually, before we do that, let's do this first. Okay, fetching values from input fields. Yes, let's do the frames first. Okay, but we didn't actually try the greet button. Let's try the greet button first. So if we run this, we should click on greet, right? And once you click on this button, it's going to call the function that is greet here, right? So it's going to print hello world. So check the terminal from here. You can see that it's printing hello world, right? What I will do in just a second is that, what if I type a name, and I want to say, once I type the name, get the value from the input field, and this is basically the main thing that you're going to do in your GUI. What do you need from the user in your chatbot? You literally need the value from the input field. That's it. Once you have this sentence, right, pass it to whatever function that you have that does the text processing, that gives you that checks the intent, that returns the response, and so on. But basically, in a chatbot, what you are going to have is, let's say, like any chat, right? You are going to have a picture, a generic picture, right, followed by the name of the user that is talking, right? And to the right, you are going to have a picture for the chatbot and the sentence that it says. And underneath, you are going to have like a field, an input field, a very big input field, right? And an input button or an enter button to enter that text. So this is basically what we need, is that when we write something and we click on something, we need to grab that value, right? So I'm just going to use that entry value, right? To grab the value from the entry or the input button, it is as easy as grabbing the element and calling something like get, Remember the getters and setters that we mentioned before in the object oriented lab؟ شباب فاكرين الجيترز والسيترز اللي اتكلمنا عليهم قبل كده؟ تمام؟ الجيترز والسيترز basically are method that returns values, right? So once we say احنا اتفقنا انه this is a class, right? So what is returned from this class is basically ايه؟ لما بتكون الكلاس دي ايه اللي بيرجع لي هنا؟ object. تمام؟ الاوبجكت ده انا مسيبه I just stored that object in this variable. تمام؟ If this is an object, then it makes sense to have a getter and setter, and actually it has a get and it has a set. Eh? No, it is already predefined. All of this is predefined. We are on the user level in the user land here. We're just using the code, using the library. You're not يعني implementing any classes. تمام؟ بكرة إن شاء الله في اللاب من 3 to 4 I'm going to show you how to use object oriented to organize all of this scattered code that you're seeing in front of you. تمام؟ طيب we can use the get, and by this is going to grab the value from the input field. So هنا grabbing the value, right? I can use this inside the function. I can say once this function is called, I want to have an if string. So instead of saying word, I'm going to have my curly braces, and I'm going to get the value from that input field, right? Once I click on this button, call this function. Once you call this function, try to get the value of the input field if there is any. If there's none, then it's going to return an empty string, right? So if this returns an empty string, I'm going to add or, then print the world or the string world, right? Maybe this is the first time you see a logic or a boolean, a logic, what do you call it? A logic operator, a logic gate inside the this curly braces. But this syntax is valid. Okay, so let's try to run this, and let's not type anything. It's going to tell you hello world, and let's try to type a name. It's going to tell you hello one by your name. Of course, you don't need to print it. You can use it elsewhere. Maybe you would want to print it in a different label in the same window. Like you take this value and you print something underneath, right? Okay, so let's talk about frames. We want to create a layout just like this one. Okay, so frames are basically one of the bigger containers, just like window, but the main container is the window. This is the one that we created. This is the root, right? So here I'm going to create some frames. And I'm going to say this is frame 1, and frame 1 is going to have the name label, this label, and the input field. Okay? All right. Actually, there is a thing that I want to mention before getting to frames. I just mentioned that you can get the value from the input field, right? Right, guys? We said that we can get the value from the input field, right? Actually, there's a different thing called dynamic placeholders. Okay, what is dynamic placeholders? Basically, you can create a placeholder based on the type that you want. Let's say that in this input field, I'm expecting what? I'm expecting only strings, only characters, right? So I'm going to create from TK library, I'm going to call the class string var, right? And I'm going to, this is a class, I'm going to associate it with the roots, and I'm going to initialize the variable with an empty string, and this is going to be my value. Once I create this value, I can pass it to this input field, right? So I can say that associate this dynamic value that is going to expect a string with this input field via this property, text variable, right? So text variable is your link between the dynamic placeholder, right, and the input field itself. This is just an alias, right? So if I have name input field, is the same as having value. Both of them are going to return to you what? The value that's going to be written here. Okay? All right. So if I run this, you should not see anything different, right? And if I try to initialize the entry, let's say something like this, place or please write anything, it's going to take this dynamic value and assign it to this current value here in this input field. Right? So please write something. All right. So if we used dynamic aliases or dynamic placeholders, then it makes sense to continue use them, right? So if I use this value, and instead of calling the name input field to get the current value that the user is typing, I can use the value here. And this is going to return the exact same result, right? So if I write anything, greet me is going to work. Okay? كله معايا؟ طيب. Let's create the frames or the layout, right? So the first frame is going to be created from tk frame, and I'm going to associate it with the root, right? Once I associate it, I think this is enough. We can add some padding, but this is going to be later on, right? So this is frame 1, and I'm going to say that frame 2 is going to be called differently. So this is the buttons frame, right? And both of them is associated with the root. Now what we want to do is the following. Let's say, actually we need to pack them. We forgot to pack the frames يا جماعة. تمام? We need to pack them or insert them into the window. تمام? So I'm going to say that frame 1 is going to be packed into the top of the window. So by saying the top, it should be at the top and contains the entire width, right? If it's top and you want the entire width or the horizontal space, you need to add fill. صح بالظبط كده. تمام. And we are going to do the same thing with the buttons frame. Okay. Now if we run this, I think the result is going to be it's going to be meaningless because we didn't use them anywhere, right? But they are there, they are at the top here, right? So what we can do, I want to let these two be associated, the label and the entry to be associated with frame 1, and I want the buttons to be associated with the buttons frame or frame 2. معايا؟ طيب حد مش فاهم اللي انا بعمله؟ انا قلت لكم يا جماعه لو تايهين قولوا لي because this is really easy. طيب هو عامه I'm recording this وهحاول upload this today، بس يعني at least دلوقتي اللي مش فاهم حاجه يقول لي و I can recap because what I will give from 3 to 4 is going to be a lot harder. yes ما احنا ما خلصناش. اوكي فاللي انا عملته ان انا كريت فريم، قلت الفريم ده هيبقى اسوشيتد مع الروت. دي اول خطوه بتعملها لما بتكريت اي element بتكريته بتحطه في فاريبل بتاسوشيته مع مين؟ مع الروت. حلو، عملت له اسوشيشن، انت عايز تعرضه دلوقتي في الويندو صح؟ فبتعمله باك، بتنسرته انتو ذا ويندو. طيب لما بيتعرض في الويندو بيبقى ليه اورينتيشن، بيبقى ليه مكان صح؟ طيب المكان ده بيتحدد على حسب السايد. لو انت شغال على باك تمام، فلو شغال على باك يبقى هتقول مثلا السايد مثلا توب باي ديفولت اول ما تديها فيل اكس هتاخد ايه؟ ذا انتاير هوريزونتال سبيس. فالفريم 1 ده هياخد ذا انتاير ايه؟ هوريزونتال سبيس وهيتحط فوق. تمام؟ طيب انا دلوقتي عملت نيم ليبل وعملت له باك وعملت انبوت فيلد وعملت له باك برضه، بس خلي بالك انا عامل لهم اسوشيشن في او عامل لهم انسرت لمين؟ للروت صح؟ فدلوقتي if I did this, if I can associate the label and the input field to instead of the root بقى يبقى ايه؟ يبقى frame 1 معايا هتلاقيهم جم بالترتيب، جم فوق كده، جم at the top. So I'm going to associate them with the frame 1 like this, and if I try to run this part هو ده ايه؟ لا سوري ده مش مشكلة، ده احنا بنتكلم على الانتري. We are just talking about the entry. Okay, so we can see that these two had appeared at the top, تمام, and this is frame 1. We need to include these two in frame 2 as well, or the buttons frame as we have named it, right? So I'm just going to say that the quit button is going to be associated with the buttons frame, and the greet button is going to be associated with the buttons frame. And if we run this, okay, you can see that everything looks like that. تمام. Now notice something at the first program is that whenever you stretch, right, whenever you stretch like this, you can see that this button actually stretch with you, right? So in order to do this, I can actually remove that geometry from here, right? So when we stretch, we want to make these two stretchable, right? So when I get to the button, I will say the following. I will say two things. First of all, it is sided left, right? Once you side two things left after each other, هيجوا ورا بعض كده يا جماعة. دي sided left, and the other one that is sided left is coming right after next to it, right? So we are going to add the fill x, right, to fill the entire x-axis, but this is not going to be enough. We want to say that whenever we stretch the window, we want to expand. So this is going to be true, right? So I'm just going to do the same thing for the quit button, like this, okay? And if we close this and run it one more time, you can see now that this is... Did we make it not resizable? Yes. Right? So we can actually do this and it is stretchable معايا. تمام؟ بس جريد فيها مشكلة. هو احنا دي اديناها لإيه؟ Oh, the input field. We give this fill x and expand to the input field. Right? I'm going to take this part and give it to the grid button. To the back of the grid button. So once I run this, I should see this in front of me. تمام. I'm actually going to remove this background because it doesn't look that good. I'm going to make it foreground. And I'm going to lower this size so it looks a little bit decent. What is happening? Oh, there is an extra comma here. Right, so it's going to look like that. And finally, I will remove this placeholder. I'm going to say this is, for example, this is going to be 3. Okay, and the list is just padding techniques, right? Okay, note that the frame 1 and the second frame is like literally لازقين في بعض يا جماعة. Frame 1 هنا اللي هو الجزء ده اللي فيه الليبل, that it has the label and it has the input field. This is frame 1, like row 1. Right? The other row, this is frame 2 that contains two buttons جنب بعض, right next to each other. Okay? These frames actually are stuck to each other vertically, right? So we can add some padding to the frames. I can say that this frame is going to take a padding, right? And let's give it a padding of the following. You can give the following values to padding. You can give in a table. You start from left, top, right, and bottom, clockwise. Okay. So let's say from the left, I don't want to add any values. From the top, let's add 5 pixels, or let's say 10 pixels. From the right, let's say I don't want to, maybe 2 pixels. And from the bottom, 10 pixels. Oh, okay, this is one of the things that is not included in TK, so you can't actually give padding to TK, so let's try TTK. Right, so this works. Okay, so we can see that here, before I resize this, you can see that there is a small 2 pixels at the right, and from the top here we can see that from the top 10 pixels and from the bottom 10 pixels. We can actually increase the bottom to see that there is actually a difference, and this is the bottom like this. Okay, and I can do the same exact thing with this padding here, but I need to do this as TTK. Right, and this is the final product. Okay, تمام. احنا كده خلصنا السيشن دي. We will meet at 3 p.m. to continue the grid system.